It began with silence. Not the kind born from peace, but the uneasy quiet that follows too much noise. The kind that lingers after days of thunder, when the world has run out of breath. It was December 1914. The Western Front, a scar across Europe, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, had frozen into stalemate, mud, wire, and blood. On one side, the British and French. On the other, the Germans. Between them lay no man's land, a wasteland of shattered trees, craters, and bodies. By that winter, the war was only 5 months old, yet already it had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. Every inch of earth was paid for in blood, and every sunrise brought another round of artillery that erased whatever had been rebuilt the night before. Soldiers lived in trenches that stank of rot and fear, wrapped in rags, sleeping beside rifles that had become extensions of their bodies. They had been told the war would be over by Christmas. That lie had carried them across oceans and fields, had filled recruitment halls and stirred patriotic songs. But as December approached, the truth was undeniable. Christmas would come, and they would still be here, cold, wet, and far from home. In the British trenches near Ypres, men huddled against the frost. Their letters home spoke of numb fingers and endless rain, of lice and rats, of dreams about warm kitchens and familiar voices. On the German side, it was the same. Homesickness written in another language. And then, on Christmas Eve, something strange began to happen. It started with a sound. Not gunfire, not the whine of shells, but singing. Faint, distant, rising above the wind. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, silent night, holy night. At first, the British thought it was a trick, some cruel taunt from the enemy trenches. But then, a few of them recognized the tune. A few even hummed along, quietly at first, unsure if they dared. The song carried through the cold air, soft and haunting, drifting over no man's land like a ghost. And then, incredibly, someone on the British side began to sing back, in English. For a moment, the war stopped. Not officially, not by orders, but by something older and stronger than any command. The gunfire faded. The artillery fell silent. And in its place, 2 armies, men who had spent months trying to kill each other, were now singing the same song, in different tongues, under the same frozen sky. By dawn, the frost had turned the ground to glass. Every step cracked like brittle ice. The men woke expecting another morning of shells and smoke, but the air was still. No rifles, no shouting, no orders barked down the line. Just a low fog hanging over no man's land, and the faint echo of carols still lingering from the night before. In some sectors, soldiers peeked over the parapet, something no one ever did, unless they had a death wish. But instead of bullets, they saw movement. German helmets, not charging, not hiding, just standing. Some waved, others held up signs, scrawled in rough English, "You no shoot, we no shoot." At first, the British didn't believe it. They thought it was bait, a trap to draw them into open fire. But when minutes passed and no shots came, curiosity began to outweigh fear. A few men raised their hands in reply. One climbed out of the trench, against all orders, and walked toward the middle of no man's land. The others watched in silence. Then a German did the same. The 2 figures met halfway, standing among the wreckage and wire, surrounded by the ghosts of the last battle. They shook hands. And somehow, that single gesture, that small act of impossible trust, broke the spell of war. Within minutes, more men were climbing out. British, German, French. They moved slowly, uncertainly, as though afraid the dream might shatter if they moved too fast. But it didn't. Soon, the middle of the battlefield, the place that had been death itself for months, was filled with soldiers laughing, talking, exchanging food and cigarettes. They traded tins of stew and loaves of bread, chocolates from care packages, even buttons and badges from their uniforms. Some swapped hats. A few passed around bottles of schnapps or rum, the cold forgotten for a while. There were translators among them, school teachers, students, men who'd studied the other side's language before the war. But most didn't need words. A smile, a handshake, a nod. It was enough. One British private wrote later that he couldn't believe how ordinary the Germans seemed. They looked just as fed up as we were, he wrote, and just as glad to be alive. Another described them as jolly fellows, not at all what we were told. Somewhere near Plögstiert, a German soldier produced a small Christmas tree, a real one, dug from behind the lines and decorated with candles. He set it down on the frozen mud, the tiny flames flickering against the mist. Around it, men began singing again, this time together. "O come all ye faithful," alternating verses in English and German. The harmonies rose and fell, carried by breath that steamed in the cold air. There were photographs taken that day, though few survive. In one, British and German soldiers stand side by side, arms slung around each other's shoulders, smiling as if they'd known one another for years. In another, men are bent over in laughter, showing off photographs of wives and children, pointing to faces they missed more than they could say. And somewhere, amid the laughter and the songs, a football appeared. No one knows who brought it. Some say it was a German, others a Scot. But soon, it was rolling across the frozen field. Helmets for goalposts, boots for the game, and a crowd of men from both sides cheering like schoolboys. For once, the field that had devoured so many lives was just a field again. They played until the ball burst or the light faded. Accounts differ, but everyone remembered the feeling. For a few brief hours the war was gone. Night fell again, and the men drifted back to their trenches, some stumbling, some laughing softly to themselves. They promised to hold the truce through Christmas Day, and in most places they did. Fires burned quietly along both sides, their glow flickering through the darkness like stars fallen to earth. Letters written that night would later astonish the people back home. Stories of Germans sharing cigars, of songs echoing across the wire, of men who had seen their enemies and found them human. The generals weren't pleased when they heard. They called it fraternization, a word meant to drain all warmth from what had happened. Orders were sent out. This must never happen again. But on that one cold Christmas of 1914, the soldiers had stopped listening. For that night, they belonged not to empires, but to something smaller and greater at once, to the shared miracle of being alive. By the morning of December 26th, the frost had thickened into armor. The laughter of the day before had faded into uneasy quiet. The men woke slowly, as if hoping the world might still be different, that the truce might somehow hold. But already, the spell was beginning to break. The first sign came from the rear lines, where officers had begun to reassert control. Word had reached high command. Stories of soldiers trading gifts with the enemy, even shaking hands with them, and the reaction was swift and furious. Commanders called it treasonous. Discipline, they said, must be restored immediately. By mid-morning, runners brought written orders, resume hostilities, no more fraternization. Anyone found communicating with the enemy would face court-martial. Some officers read the orders aloud, their voices heavy with discomfort. Others refused to pass them down right away, staring out across no man's land, where men were still waving to each other, unaware that the brief peace they'd built was already dying. On both sides, soldiers hesitated. They looked out across the frost-bitten field, the same ground they'd walked the day before, the same men they'd spoken with, laughed with, sung with. It didn't feel right to raise a rifle now. Not after that. But wars don't wait for feelings. Slowly, gunfire returned. A few warning shots first, not aimed to kill, just reminders of the world they'd tried to forget. Then came the artillery, distant at first, then closer, louder, until the air was shaking again. By the afternoon, the truce had ended almost everywhere. The smoke returned, the shouting, the chaos, the familiar terror. Yet even as the war swallowed the world again, something lingered. In pockets of the front, soldiers delayed firing as long as they could. Some deliberately aimed high. A few passed quiet gestures. Small waves, a raised hand, a look that said, "I remember." One German corporal wrote in his diary that it was the hardest thing he had ever done, to lift his rifle and fire toward men he had shared bread with 2 days before. They were our enemies again, he wrote, but not as before. It felt like shooting at ourselves. The truce had lasted only a day or two in most places, but its memory outlived the war itself. Letters home carried the story across Europe, then across the world. People couldn't believe it. That soldiers had stopped fighting on their own, that the enemy had sung Christmas songs and played football together. For a brief moment, it made the world wonder if humanity might still survive its own madness. Of course, the generals hated that idea. In the years that followed, both sides worked hard to make sure such a thing would never happen again. They rotated units more frequently, forbade any signs of friendliness, and intensified bombardments during holidays to crush any chance of peace. But they couldn't erase what had already happened, because even in the bloodiest war the world had ever known, even in the trenches where men drowned in mud and fear, the soldiers had shown that there was still a line they could cross, not in battle, but in mercy. Decades later, when veterans were old and grey, they still spoke about that Christmas. Some cried as they remembered the singing, the laughter, the strange, fleeting warmth that had come over the frozen fields. One British private said he never forgot the faces of the Germans he met that day. How human they looked when they smiled. How wrong it felt to call them the enemy afterward. For the rest of the war, he said, I shot high. The Christmas Truce of 1914 didn't end the war. It didn't change the general's plans or stop the killing that would go on for 4 more years. But it revealed something the armies couldn't control. The simple, dangerous truth that ordinary men could disobey hate, if only for one night. That, perhaps, is why the story still matters. Because in a world where orders demanded death, the soldiers chose life. And in doing so, they gave us a glimpse of what peace might look like, even in hell. And maybe that's the real miracle of Christmas. In the years that followed, the Christmas truce became something halfway between memory and myth. Some called it a miracle. Others tried to pretend it never happened. The soldiers who were there rarely spoke of it in public, not because they were ashamed, but because they knew few would understand. How could you explain to someone who'd never been in those trenches what it felt like to hear silence again? To walk across a killing field and shake hands with a man whose rifle had been aimed at your heart the day before. It wasn't just peace, it was disbelief. A pause in a nightmare so complete that it almost felt unreal. But it was real. Letters from both sides confirmed it. Diaries describe the singing, the football, the shared meals, the candles flickering in the dark. For once, the words from the front were not about horror, but about hope, a fragile human hope that refused to die even in the mud. When the stories reached the newspapers back home, they stunned the public. In Britain, some papers printed them with quiet pride. Others called it weakness. Politicians worried that if soldiers could see the enemy as human, they might lose their will to fight. But among the families who had sons at the front, the reaction was different. For them, it was a small light in a dark time. Proof that somewhere in that endless war, their boys had remembered what it meant to be men. On the German side, censors tried to suppress the letters. Commanders called the truce a dangerous lapse in discipline. But even there, the story spread, whispered in taverns, in churches, in letters smuggled home to mothers and wives. The people understood what their leaders did not, that peace, even for a day, was not weakness. It was strength of a different kind. After the war, as Europe buried its dead and tried to rebuild from the ashes, the truce took on new meaning. Monuments rose to honor the fallen, but few remembered that on one winter's night, those same men had chosen not to fall. It was easier for nations to remember heroism than humanity. Still, the story endured, told in songs, in plays, in quiet conversations among old soldiers who still remembered the sound of carols echoing across no man's land. They spoke of it not as an act of rebellion, but as a moment of grace. One British sergeant, interviewed in the 1960s, said it best: "We were supposed to hate them, but that night we didn't. We saw them as men, and that was enough to stop the war, for a little while." There's something haunting about that peace can come so easily when men are left to themselves and vanish the moment their leaders return. The truce showed what could happen when humanity slipped through the cracks of command, when soldiers stopped being weapons and started being people again. It didn't end the war, no. But maybe it revealed the truth about all wars, that beneath every uniform, every anthem, every line drawn in mud, there are people who all want the same thing: to live, to go home, to see another Christmas. Today, more than a century later, the Christmas Truce of 1914 stands as one of the most extraordinary moments in modern history, not because of its scale, but because of its simplicity. It wasn't negotiated by diplomats. It wasn't ordered by generals. It happened because a few men, frozen and homesick, decided that for one night they were done killing. And somehow that decision spread, trench to trench, song to song, until the war itself seemed to stop and listen. Every year, people still visit those fields in Belgium and France, where once there were trenches, wire, and blood. They leave candles, footballs, and handwritten notes in the frost. The ground is quiet now, the scars long covered by grass. But if you stand there on a cold December night, when the wind moves low across the fields, you might almost hear it, faint singing, drifting through the dark. Not as ghosts, not as soldiers, but as voices. Voices of men who, for one brief and impossible night, proved that even in a world at war, peace is never truly lost. It's only waiting for someone brave enough to remember it. More than 100 Christmases have passed since that winter on the Western Front. The names of the villages have faded from memory. The trenches have melted back into the soil, and the men who stood there are all gone. But the story they left behind refuses to die. The Christmas truce has become something more than a footnote in history. It's a question that still hangs in the air, quietly accusing us. If ordinary soldiers knee-deep in mud and misery, could lay down their weapons and see each other as human beings, even for a single day. What does that say about the rest of us? About the leaders who send others to fight, or the generations who keep finding new reasons to hate? The men of 1914 didn't set out to make history. They weren't philosophers or politicians. They were cold, hungry, and scared. But maybe that's exactly why what they did mattered so much. Because when everything around them demanded cruelty, they chose kindness. When the world ordered them to hate, they sang instead. Think about that for a moment. The sheer courage it took not to pull a trigger. It's easy to obey orders. It's harder to disobey hate. Historians sometimes downplay the truce, calling it isolated, accidental, even naive. But those few hours of peace spoke louder than all the artillery shells that surrounded them. They proved that war, for all its machinery and propaganda, still depends on human hands, and that those same hands can choose not to kill. In a way, the Christmas truce was never really over. The men went back to fighting, yes, but they carried that memory with them. Some said it haunted them for the rest of their lives. Others said it saved them, that it reminded them there was still something worth living for beyond the wire. And perhaps that's what we're meant to remember. That humanity doesn't vanish in war. It hides. It waits for a song, or a moment of silence, or the sight of a stranger's smile to wake it again. You can still find letters from those soldiers tucked away in museum archives, faded ink on yellowed paper, written by candlelight on that frozen night. One German wrote, "I met the English. They are not devils, they are men like us." Another, a British corporal, said, "It was the greatest lesson I ever learned, that the enemy is only a word." 100 years later, the world is still fighting. Different fields, different names, same grief. But every time we hear this story, every time we picture those men standing together in the snow, we are reminded that even in the darkest chapters of history, the light is never entirely gone. It flickers, sometimes faint, sometimes nearly invisible, but it's there, in the songs, in the laughter, in the impossible silence between gunfire. The Christmas truce of 1914 wasn't a miracle that ended a war. It was a moment that showed what peace could look like, if only we'd let it breathe. And maybe that's its legacy, not in what it changed, but in what it revealed, that even in a world built for conflict, peace is still the most natural thing we have. Because when the guns fell silent that night, and voices rose in song across the empty field, the world saw itself, not as enemies, not as nations, but as people. And for one fragile, beautiful night, that was enough.